Well, it is my pleasure to introduce you to a phenomenal scholar, Denis Gregoire of HEC Montreal. His PhD is from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and he does work on cognitive processes supporting entrepreneurship, innovation, and strategy. And he's currently associate editor at the Academy of Management Journal. And as you've seen from the papers that you read today, two of his papers were on experimental research in entrepreneurship. He is an advocate and a supporter of experimental research in entrepreneurship. So with that said, Denis, welcome and thank you for taking the time to talk to our audience.
My great pleasure. Hold on, let me just see if I had a water bottle. I'm guessing I lost it. All right. Okay, never mind.
So let's start with the first question, Denis. How did you get interested in entrepreneurship research or business research? When you were growing up, did you say, I want to be a business professor and an entrepreneurship researcher someday?
Not at all. And this is I guess it's a typical introduction. So I guess I'll share a little bit about my background. So I grew up in a small mining town in the French-speaking part of Canada. It's called the province of Quebec. My parents were high school teachers. I grew up in a family. My grandparents were musicians, so I guess I played music a whole lot when I was a kid. Did well in school, and eventually I decided to enter college, to start college in architecture, because there was a creative part of architecture that appealed to me. And I was good at solving problems, engineering type of problems. So I figured building was going to be a nice thing. But I very rapidly discovered that I didn't have what it took to become a successful architect. I persevered with the first degree. There are two degrees. I mean, you eventually, to practice architecture in Canada, you need like a master. So I did the first degree, but even during the program, I knew that I was going to end. I was not going to practice as an architect. I was going to move to something. I didn't know what that something was going to be. But I eventually decided to transfer to business school because of several reasons. First, I thought it was broad in terms of where it could lead to, and I had also worked, student jobs, but I'd appreciate that I already had a sort of insight that managers, and especially when you work on projects, it's a profession, and you could really influence how projects get about. And so I was interested in developing the skills and knowing more about how to lead things in the business world. But more importantly, I had started a venture right after actually it's not true, but I had discussed ideas about starting a venture. And when I started business school, I was involved in a venture, which fast forward a few years, undergrad in business, but because I already had a degree, I was able to move quite fast, and eventually I was invited to switch to the graduate program. And this is at the time when I was involved in a startup, building on a project that I had done in architecture. I started that with a friend, but essentially we were involved in making some cardboard furniture, which is a very classic exercise we do in architecture or in other design programs. But we had a cool design. We just wanted to know, how do you go about working on a cardboard chair that you do by hand and to mass produce this? And so we ended up raising some money through some grants, and we found a way to import cardboard, and essentially we mass produced the smallest possible orders we could make, but there was still like 450 chairs, and we ended up selling them. And so I was still in business school, and I had this entrepreneurial experience, and they were looking for a TA in entrepreneurship, and I was the only one around who had some experience. So they offered me the job, and I turned it down. I said no again, but eventually, there's some reason, I'll get the details, but eventually I took on the job, and so I became a TA in entrepreneurship while finishing my master's. And the master's involved writing a thesis. It was a Master of Science in Management, but I didn't write a master's in entrepreneurship. It was very much org theory driven. So I was interested in communications and organizational change. So I was reading a lot about that literature. So my orientation was very much sociology. And I wrote a long thesis and it was relatively successful. But on the side, I kept working with undergrad students who had business ideas. And after I finished, economy was, somewhat out of a recession, but there were not a whole lot of jobs. So I didn't quite know what I wanted to do, but I was offered basically a buffet of different things. And so I continued to work as a research assistant because I had some skills, I guess. This was at HEC Montreal where I came back 15 years later. But anyway, I'll tell you that part of the story because it's important. So I'd finished my master's. I'm offered a few positions, a few tasks. Like, so I'm research associate, research assistant, and so I'm involved in collecting data, analyzing data, and this is before Google, right before Google. And then I eventually was involved to do some TAing in class, but eventually I was going to be offered to teach my own class. So I had teaching experience. At the same time, I worked as a consultant part-time. And initially I was doing basically I was a subcontractor for a consultant. And the kind of mandates that they had me write was still in entrepreneurship. So essentially I help entrepreneurs to polish their business plan, their PowerPoints, because I wrote relatively well, relatively fast in 2 languages, in French and English. One quick aparté here, I was raised in French, but I went to my architecture degree. I chose to go and I did that at McGill in English. So by that point, I'm fully bilingual with an accent, as you can hear. Anyway, the point is that I'm, as a consultant, as a young consultant, I was like 26, 27. I was bilingual. I wrote fast. I could structure a document very well. I was very good at synthesis. I could work on PowerPoint. I had some design skills. So I had some skills that were valuable. And essentially, I worked on polishing entrepreneurs' business plan. But this meant that I was involved in entrepreneurs' efforts to raise money. At the time when the business angel industry in the Montreal ecosystem was non-existent. This is the time of the dot-com boom. So there was, new project coming around. So it was very, very practical experience to what that world of entrepreneurship was. And I had no idea that I was going to do a PhD. Eventually, some people were asking me, okay, well, are you going to remain like in between these different jobs, doing like a little bit of TAing, teaching, and then some consulting? And then I didn't know. I was very hesitant as to what I could do. I mean, clearly some people thought I had some skills to do research. At the same time, I was wondering if one of those businesses that I was doing mandates for would hire me. It didn't happen, and eventually the dot-com came to an end. But before the dot-com boom busted, my master's advisor asked me a question that sort of changed my framing about PhD, and she essentially asked me whether I was afraid of doing a PhD because I didn't know what a PhD could lead outside of where I was in Montreal. And by asking me that question, she basically forced me to think that if I did a PhD, I didn't have to stay in Montreal, and I could do the PhD wherever I wanted. And after that, the world was possible. I mean, if I did relatively well, I could do wherever was possible. And it sort of completely changed the framing of how I was hesitant about doing a PhD or not. So much so that we had this conversation at 10:30 in the morning, and by 4 o'clock in that afternoon, I had renewed my passport, scheduled an appointment to do a GMAT 2 months down the road, canceled a bunch of or reduced the amount of consulting I was due so that I could study for the GMAT and maximize the chance that I would do a solid GMAT. And I already had identified about a dozen schools where I could send in applications, and I knew the deadlines. So this is about like when you have a question that changes your framing and you go from being hesitant to action, which is many of us, we study entrepreneurs and we see them do these kind of decisions, right? They don't have an idea, they don't know what they want to do, and then all of a sudden they come across a use case and they go from being hesitant to being completely committed to a venture. I experienced that. So right away, I decided, yeah, I will try to see if I could at least submit an application to do a PhD. Because keep in mind that by that time I'd been working on for 3 years as a RA for entrepreneurship professor. So I knew the literature, I knew a few things about the literature, I knew about conferences, I knew about authors. I mean, I had learned through this a number of things about research. I'd even organized an entrepreneurship conference, a mini conference, I should say. So I had some experience. So by now it became very clear what I wanted to do. And so that's the sort of long story where I went from architecture to business to an org theory thesis to eventually deciding to do a PhD. I applied to several schools. I had a very solid GMAT, and this opened a number of doors for me. I received a number of offers. I was invited to campus visits, but eventually I chose to do a PhD. Took my time doing it. I wanted to do a number of different studies. I was developing the use of experimental methods at a time when there was not a whole lot of people doing that. So I wanted to make sure I did everything by the book, crossed my T's, dotted my I's. And during that program, eventually I was on the market. The market wasn't that good, but Nathalie, we already had a kid. And we decided to remain in the US, even if, and we made that decision consciously, trying to see, again, thinking about it like entrepreneurs, or let's see what happens if we get a job offer in the US. And we eventually got one. So we stayed in the US and lived in the US for 14 years before HSC made me an offer I could not refuse. And so I went back to Montreal, and that's about 9 years ago. And since then, I'm on my X. I do great things. I do things that are very meaningful to me at a school that values what I do. And family is happy.
Perfect. Well, that's what counts, right? Happy family and happy good work.
So I hope this wasn't too long and circumvoluted, but you basically got the basic story of.
I did, and I had a question. Yesterday, we had Melissa Cardin as our speaker, and she said she used to play the cello. What did you used to play?
I was trained as a classical pianist for several years. 12 years, basically. I was trained. I'm not particularly good. My sound is not really good, but I still play. But more than that, as a teenager, I picked up the trombone, and I ended up playing in school band, high school bands, but eventually jazz band. Even while I was in architecture, I would still play with the university band. So I was, I played some jazz, played some pop, was on stage, played in bars, this kind of thing. Never at a professional level, but good enough to have fun.
Wonderful. So my next question to you is, you are one of the prominent scholars in entrepreneurship who do and advocate experimental research. What do you think is the past, present, future of experimental research in entrepreneurship?
Okay. Well, allow me to politely correct you. I am an entrepreneurship scholar that advocates research. I wouldn't say that I'm a prominent scholar. The past of experimental research. Well, that's. I think you've read some papers. I guess we all know what it is. The present is that there's more and more people that are conducting experiments. I'm currently here in the Netherlands at Groningen. They organize a workshop every year typically in the spring, late February, early March. It's an online workshop where they do a two-part. One of it is educational. They have a number of keynote speakers who give advice about doing experiment in entrepreneurship research, but they also have like a mini conference where different people present experimental papers and get, again, advice from people in the audience, kind of like a mini conference. They've done this for 5 years already. And this, alongside with other efforts for many years, group of friends, we were doing a PDW at the Academy of Management Conference. We no longer do this PDW because we believe that there's enough of a community now that does it, and this workshop in Groningen does the job. So clearly there are people who are doing this. And what's interesting is that people do experiment in entrepreneurship across the board of the phenomenon. I mean, including from the very early start, the kind of experiments that I did for my dissertation, which are about coming up with the idea, to deciding to exploit the idea. There's a lot of experiments now on VC decision making, whether from the VC side or from the entrepreneurship side. There are experiments about feedback in entrepreneurship. So everything that most of the experiments tend to be individual level, but I've seen some team stuff. So in terms of present, there's already a lot of stuff happening. But the back end of your questions were about the future, or what are perhaps the problems and opportunities. I mean, was there some of that in your back end?
Yeah. What's the future, and what do you see as problems and opportunities in experimental research in entrepreneurship?
So the opportunities are plenty in terms of what to study and what topics and what theories to bring in. But the challenges, like always, they're all about doing it's not just doing good research. It's the challenge is to do excellent research, because that's the bar for having an impact. And I'm not talking about impact factor, and I'm talking about like advancing knowledge. And this you can publish everywhere, anywhere. That's not really, but doing research that really gets you to think and gets you to realize, you know, because I did this research, now I know more about this little phenomenon. So on the experiment side, if I think of the papers that I've reviewed or seen at presentations or at conferences, or some of the dissertations that I evaluated, or papers that I made decisions on at AMJ, I would say that the three challenges, or the three things that I've seen that I'm still sometimes disappointed about, would be the first one is experimental, and I'm talking about the experimental task itself. Like if you have subjects, right, individuals who you ask to take part in this experiment, right, and what you have them do, it doesn't connect with anything real. It doesn't connect with anything that entrepreneurs would encounter or would typically do. Something that's it's too hypothetical. It's too abstract. There's not enough information. It's too made up to be real. This is always frustrating to me. So it's typically a research where you have some theory idea, and you go ahead and you design an experiment, but the task itself is. So I'll give you a sort of a made up example, but you'll get a sense of this. So, you know, some people's interested in risk and how some aspect of entrepreneurship decision making is risk. Okay, leave aside the distinction between risk and uncertainty. Let's just buy in that entrepreneurs do risky things, fine. And then the entrepreneurial task is, you know, choosing between two lotteries. I understand that from a formal standpoint, choosing between two lotteries is something about. It's one method that you'll see in behavioral economics to discern people's risk preferences. But in terms of their day-to-day activities, I'm involved in two different incubator programs dealing with tech businesses for more than 7 years. I've yet to encounter any single tech entrepreneur who one day came to the office and had to decide between two lotteries. So that's kind of what I mean, when the task itself has very little to do with what entrepreneurs, or sometimes it's a task that comes much, much later in the life of a business, and you're asking entrepreneurs to do that at the very beginning. Again, doesn't it doesn't really jive. I see a lot of action here on the chat.
Greg, I can monitor that.
You can monitor that?
Yeah, but go ahead. You said there are 3 things, right? So this was the first thing.
Okay, so that's the first one. Are you still with me? I have some writing about this because Vishal was very kind. He sent me some things, so I was able to prepare a little bit. Didn't do any slides, but okay. The second thing, so the first thing is about experimental tasks that are real. The second thing that I'm always disappointed on, not always, I shouldn't say that, but I'm frequently disappointed on is you have studies who develop an experimental task. Let's say it's realistic. You do a study and nowhere in the data collection is there any valuation that the manipulation is valid. So we're talking about construct validity and manipulation effectiveness. Now, in the JBV papers that I believe you've read, my co-authors and I, we wrote about this, but ultimately it needs to be tested, and this can make it. This is important for establishing the validity of the experiment, but there are many benefits in doing this yourself before any reviewers or associate editor ask you to do this, because you're going to learn a lot about your study by pre-testing this, by doing some validation studies before the actual main study, and even while you do the main study, doing this and validating whether it's through manipulation checks or actual construct validity. I mean, eventually you need to do both to show that the what you're manipulating is really perceived by the subjects as in line with theory, and that it's effective, that it has an effect. And the difficulty there is that if you don't do this, you start drawing conclusions about whatever value that you obtain in your results, and then the reviewers come back at you and saying, well, it's interesting that you have p-value, but how can you be sure that these results really are about what you're theorizing in the first place? So that's one situation. The other situation is that, so you need to be able to defend against this. The other situation is that you go ahead and you don't do any pilot tests and you conduct your experiments and you don't have any results because the manipulation itself was too subtle, too discrete to be effective. So you've basically wasted data. You've wasted subject to your dissertation. So that's the second thing that I would say is important to pay attention in the design of an experiment. Construct validity and manipulation effectiveness. You want to make sure that you do that and you think about how you're going to collect this data early on. So I'm a big advocate of pilot tests and pre-tests and manipulation check while you're doing this. So that was the second point. And the third point, it's more of a minor thing, but I did my dissertation 23 years ago, and at the time I remember telling my peers and professors that I thought that one of the biggest challenge in entrepreneurship research was the difficulty to access qualified samples, meaning like to access entrepreneurs to take part in research. And it's still true today. And where this challenge comes up as important is that since the time I finished my dissertation, there are a number of platforms that made it somewhat easier to access samples. I mean, we know of Amazon MTurk, we know of Prolific. Many of us have used Prolific. Qualtrics. If you have more money, you could contract Qualtrics for finding subjects for you. It's an expensive proposition, but it'll do it. The problem is that many papers are sent to journals, or I did collect some data on Prolific, and if you start looking into data quality check about the sample, you realize that people who answer surveys may not be the ones who claim to be who they are. And this has a tremendous downward impact on the quality of your data. So just today, working with co-authors here, and we have some prolific data. And you look at some, within the data collections, we have some open-ended boxes where people are supposed to answer a few things. You do a check, and a solid 25% of those boxes are just gibberish, meaningless text that's entered there, making you think that either the person it might be a real person who's filling the survey, and just couldn't care less about giving quality data there, which raises doubt about whatever else was entered in the survey, or the chatbot that's answering your survey. Because right now, and I work with an incubator with AI businesses, there are AI, it's possible, it's actually pretty easy. You can take up if you think ChatGPT is dangerous, yeah, it's pretty easy. There are plugins that you say, okay, generate a program, generate a heuristic that is going to answer somewhat reasonable answer to all sort of survey. And if you're collecting 10 cents a survey and you have 20 computers working 24/7 on surveys that take 5 minutes to answer, and you have this computer farm somewhere in whatever country, you can generate some nice little side income right there and there. Basically filling surveys in something that is reasonably sensible, right? If you think about it, I'm asking a series of questions on a matrix. It tends to be that all the questions on that matrix will target 2 or 3 constructs, right? Sometimes just one construct. So as long as the answers are in the same range and it's not like random, it's going to be very difficult for people to detect that it's a chatbot answering. So my point is that there's a lot of surveys being sent to journal that are using these crowdsourcing sample, and it's certainly defensible in some cases. But if you don't have any if you don't have any checks to validate the data of your sample, more and more users, and Melissa is one of them, more and more users of Prolifix are knowledgeable enough to know that chances are you have garbage in your data. And if you don't have checks to parse that out, your analysis are wrong. Your results are wrong. And so because more and more reviewers, more and more authors, more and more journal editors are aware of that, it's a big red flag for me when you see that. I place a lot of value in people's ability to either defend that they have some checks, that the people they kept in their analysis are people who seem knowledgeable about the phenomenon, they seem to be the right participant, or manual collection of data. Dean Shepard's dissertation, he physically went to see all the VCs in his conjoint studies. Andrew Zakarakis did the same thing for a very similar dissertation. I know it's a pain, it's painful, it may even reduce your sample size, although some of it you could do online through Zoom. There's all sort of ways to do things, but I would urge people to, when you do experiments, even if we all target a large sample size for statistical power, make sure that you have ways to at least offer some evidence that the people who completed your experiments are the ones who claim that really are the ones that claim to be qualified for this. Otherwise, there's a high risk that your results are not real.
Got it. So at this time, let me open up the floor to questions from the audience. I saw some people type questions or raise hands. So do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Umesh, I think you had a question.
Yes, Professor.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this insightful and quite frank, journey about your entrepreneurial research. Professor, can we pivot our experimental design? If so, are there any use cases which you could share with us?
Could you describe a little bit more what you mean by pivot?
Like when in this case of design thinking in entrepreneurship, when the entrepreneurs are building product, so they have some notion, they carry or they build the design in a way where there is a chance of pivoting and maybe reducing some aspects or adding some new aspects to it. So when we are designing this experimental design for research, are there any use cases available where if we are working on it and we find, okay, this could be problematic. It could create a problem, or we are not finding XYZ responses for it. So how do we pivot around that?
Okay. All right. So the short answer to this is going to be yes and no. And the explanation will come from what it is that entrepreneurs do when they pivot and when they experiment. So let's start with what entrepreneurs do when they experiment. So if you teach entrepreneurship, you could look at the case Dropbox. You could look at the case Rent the Runway, both published on Harvard Business School's case for education. Essentially, these ventures, they were interested, for instance, on pricing or on what features to include in their product. And what they did in terms of experiment is they came to present potential clients, or in some case even real clients, with variation on their product line or their product, and some real life pricing experiment that real entrepreneurs do is that they'll say, okay, it's very early stage entrepreneurs, right? They just have a small flow of beta tester. The first page on whatever website where people sign up for their services, they're going to go with a different page. So all of a sudden, you get a 20% discount for signing up for 1 year, or you do an extra tier of pricing, and they collect data just on 2-3 days, and they'll eventually they'll close the experiment and then go back to their regular pricing structure. And so for a few months, they have these people in their roster that have a different contract with the firm. Real ventures actually do these kind of experiments, right? And so they learn from these experiments about pricing or about what features to add. Can they pivot this experiment? No, the experiment is done, right? They were interested about these two things, manipulating these two things in the experiment. They can't change this. If they change it, it becomes a new experiment. So they could do that the following week, say, okay, well, we're going to change this. Now you could get a 5-year contract, or we're going to add different features, different mix of features. That's perfectly okay, but these are different experiments, right? So the experiment themselves, you can't pivot, because an experiment strength is based on the sort of consistency between the hypothesis or theory you have coming in and the data you're collecting. If you change it as the experiment is going on, well, you're introducing new things, so you might as well close the first experiment and start a second one. So that's why a lot of applied psychology papers will have study 1, study 2, study 3, study 4, because they're saying, okay, well, we're going to test just this, we're going to test just that, just like experiments do. Now, from doing all these experiments, can you pivot your pricing model, or can you pivot your theory model or your theoretical exploration for a phenomenon? This you can. Certainly entrepreneurs can pivot their business. There's no question about this. But with respect to pivoting a research, not pivoting the experiment, but pivoting your theorizing, then it's a question of whether you follow the standard pure theory-driven model, where you start with a theory and either the theory is proven or not, and if it's not proven, then you start designing a new theory. And there's all this advice out there about all these papers who are conducting some research. They don't quite know what the theory, but they do the research, they test a few things, and then they work backwards from results to creating hypothesis and say, oh yeah, we had this theory beforehand, whereas it's not what happened. In real life, they collected a bunch of data, they explored the analysis. If they saw any p-values below 0.05, then they regressed back to some hypothesis, then they created a theory about this. Technically, this is not the right way of doing science. We all know it's done, but we don't advise about this. This is called harking, by the way. So this is, I don't think this is the kind of pivot you are arguing for, and I would certainly not support that. This is why there's a great big push in many journals now for pre-registering your hypothesis and your theoretical model ahead of conducting the data. It may not be so common in entrepreneurship journals, but it's happening in other journals. My point is, pivoting an experiment while you're doing it, no. Do a different experiment. Pivoting your understanding of phenomenon, absolutely. This is possible. What you need to be clear is when exactly is the theory fixed and when do you then test the theory? That would be something useful.
And Denise, what I got from your answer is when you do an experiment, a lot of the work happens in the pre-stage of designing and thinking through the experiment. And then you implement it, right?
Yeah.
And then if you realize at some point that you made a mistake of some sort in your designing, then you run a new experiment. Then that experiment is correct.
That's absolutely true. And I think I wrote this. I may even have written this in my dissertation. But the big difference between doing archival research and experimental research is where you spend the time. And you see that when you review papers. A lot of archival research, collecting the data is almost instantaneous, right? Okay, I'm downloading this panel data from so-and-so organization. Data is collected, end of story. Cleaning up the data, that's a task. And so many PhD students are involved in panel data. They need to clean up like this, making validation tests. Okay, there's bad entries on here and there's like cleaning up. This could take months. In experiments, it's the other way around. You spend months pre-testing, validating all of this, but once you launch the experiment, you download the data, and data is the data, right? You may clean up like the mistaken answer and gibberish, things like that, but after that, analysis could go pretty fast.
Wonderful. So Fred, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. So Dr. Denis, you really struck my chord when you're talking about your past experience. As someone just about to start my PhD studying University of Alabama, it really is some of my anxiety. You talked a lot about the complication of data quality and experimental research. I read some research on limiting the response time of survey data collecting process to increase the quality of the data. Correct me if I'm wrong. Experimental research usually limit the variables, right? Wouldn't it be an advantage when it comes to the quality of data, especially we could do maybe like a small scale experiment first to save time and resources?
So your main concern is really about the length it takes participants to complete the study?
No, that's not my concern. My concern is I don't know, falling behind or stuff like that. Dr. Gupta's here, and I guess that's just my anxiety, of falling behind or like that.
I think Denise, if I'm understanding correctly, he's saying as a PhD student, do you start off by doing a small scale study so that you're making progress rather than designing a big experimental study that then could work out, could not work out? How would you suggest a PhD student approach an experimental investigation for the first time?
Okay, I think I understand. Thank you for this clarification. I think we're very fortunate in entrepreneurship that the people we're studying face this very challenge. And if you work in an incubator or if you teach entrepreneurship, and I'm not, I think it's especially true for teaching. Sorry for the lack of a better term, like real entrepreneurship, being like not just an undergrad course where people basically at the end of the course they have to come up with a business plan or business idea. But they'll not even test the feasibility. I'm talking about people who are ready to commit on the line and they are putting some real money and real time and effort in an incorporated venture that is actually going to try to when the stakes are a little bit real. There are, so I'm working in one of those incubators, and some of these are incubators anyway, and we see this sometimes where entrepreneurs, before they talk to potential customers, they want to have the perfect prototype with all the features they possibly envisions, to make sure that they can present the prototype and really excite their potential customers, right? And then there's other people in the same incubators that they are full-on effectuation, full-on experimental. I mean, they're like Sarasvati's dream entrepreneurs. Like they don't have a prototype. It's like the Dropbox first prototype. Do you know what it was? It was a short video with a PowerPoint that explained what Dropbox would be. There was it was zero code. I mean, you talk about no code software. They didn't have a product. They just have a description of what Dropbox would be. They actually launched that in a bunch of in a small group chat of tech people, and they got real data suggesting, well, there might be some interest for this kind of thing because it would be better than what existed at the time. So you see where I'm going with this is that real life entrepreneurs give us a great lesson about how to handle this problem. Real life entrepreneurs, they go rapidly into the testing phase. So my advice is, if you want to advance your dissertation, yes, eventually we want to have a dissertation that makes an impact. It's going to take time, but there is value in developing small projects that will help you along the way test. And I'm not saying that I was particularly good at that myself, but it is fair to say that I took longer to do. I took 5 years to do my dissertation. I guess they still had confidence I would do something, but I did collect data early on. I did one pilot test with students that I presented at Babson at the end of my 4th year. I had collected the data in the fall. Pilot test didn't work. The manipulation, I had the knowledge manipulation. It was way too complicated, but I'm glad I did this, because this suggested, okay, for your main study, don't do that. And it helped me own the survey itself, like how long it would be to collect this data. So my advice is small steps, multiple small steps, pivot, learn, fail fast, lean startup method. That's if you can do this, there's value there.
Wonderful. I think we have another question from Lucia.
Yes, thank you, Professor Gupta. Thank you, Professor Gregoire. I am wondering, right now I am focused on trying to assess what is the entrepreneurial mindset. The claim is that it's not necessarily something that entrepreneurs can have or have, but also other individuals that are probably working within a company and are developing new products or services. The approach I was following was developing a scale, integrating some other previous validated constructs. But today I had this conversation with one professor, and he suggested me to go for experimental design because what is within the definition of entrepreneurial mindset are actually behaviors that are dynamic. So my question is, should I go for example, doing an experiment that try to understand how these individuals make decisions with limited information, and then another experiment trying to understand if they remain adaptable and resilient, and then another experiment if to know if they can act well under uncertain and complex conditions, and how this can at the end be all integrated in order to describe this entrepreneurial mindset. I don't know if I explain my question well, Professor Gregoire.
I can answer the last question. Yes, you did. As for the other questions, I'm afraid it's not my place to tell you what you should or should not do. My approach to research is that these are design questions that fundamentally concern you and your research team and your advisors and your close associates at this point. What I could say, however, is to draw your attention to the distinctions between what you call developing a scale, and there are different scales. You know, instruments to measure. I tend to use the word instrument, like a psychometric instrument to measure an attitude, to measure knowledge, to measure evaluations, are fundamentally different than a diagnostic tool, meaning a tool to determine if someone has a disease or some mental illness. So you want to be careful about ultimately how you conserve, what's your concept of an entrepreneurial mindset? And I would start there. So this will help determine whether it makes sense to orient your research to a different kind of instrument, or to measure to measure the impact of some stimulus on the behavior. So again, my main point is I can't really comment much on this. I would encourage you to talk to your advisor, but my advisors, your research team, but think about what it is that you want to study. What's the phenomenon that you want to study, and start from there.
Thank you, Professor.
That's all of the best I can offer. Thank you. Vishal, there is Oscar had a question in the chat about access to sample when you want to do fast testing and pilot testing. Allow me to just quickly handle this one, and then we'll move on to the next question. I guess the solution to this, and again, the real life entrepreneurs, they give us very good insights about this. If samples are limited, start close, starts easy, make it small, learn, and then move to bigger. So the first pilot test that I did with students at Colorado, and then I moved to, and I did undergrad students, and then I moved to MBAs, which we didn't have a lot of MBAs in Colorado, but they had relevant experience and knowledge. And then eventually I moved to other samples, including entrepreneurs locally in Boulder in Colorado, and then entrepreneurs nationally for the main study. So approach to the sample and scale up. Like for the early learning of developing a project, go close, stay close, minimize risk, minimize cost, minimize everything. You just want to learn fast, see if this is realistic. So basically approach the pilot test and development process in sort of a natural progression thing. That will work very well. That's my advice on this.
Wonderful. And I think that's consistent with what you said earlier about thinking like an entrepreneur who, you know, and yeah, scaling.
The more I advance in my career, and the more I can't claim that I know or understand, but I certainly have been exposed to a lot of real life entrepreneurs, and I'm fortunate to be working in these two programs. One of them I wear proudly. It gave me, yeah, just exposure to a lot more many cases that I had when I was a doctoral student, and I think there's tremendous value in, yeah, just thinking about how would an entrepreneur approach this. So as I'm aging, I'm getting more and more like Sarah's. Think like an entrepreneur, which is good.
I think we have a question from Pedro. Pedro,
yeah, thanks so much, Professor Gupta. Professor Gregoire, thank you for your time here today. I have a very direct question. And you gave two great tips on publishing experiments. So the reality of task at hand, the validity of the manipulation or the people taking the experiment. Your 2019 paper also brings like some of the best practices and so the paper we read. But as a reviewer and editor, what tips you can give us to create kind of like that wow factor when submitting to top journals a solid contribution with experiments? So what are you looking at that you expect from that when you're reviewing for MJ or JBV and so on?
I knew, yeah, it's the kind of question that if I if I knew, I guess I would do it. Jokes aside, it is. I'm here in Groningen, and there's another associate editor from AMJ here, Flora Rink. She's a micro editor. Jeff McMullen was here a few days ago. Matt Grimes is here next Friday. We get asked this question all the time. It's like, once you become an editor someplace, everyone wants to know, okay, so how do we publish? And especially in the context of experiment, I guess the short answer to this, and the most generic answer, I mean, it varies so much by papers. There's no shortcut. The one general thing I could say is there's no shortcut. It's hard, it's difficult, just like in entrepreneurship. I mean, sometimes you're lucky. You start, it's a blue ocean. You're the only one. There's no competitors forever. Sometimes you're lucky, but even when you're lucky, you have to work hard. I mean, Jeff Bezos, yeah, he's fantastic, great idea, dominant monopoly of sort. But I don't think he had it easy. He certainly put a lot of effort, made sacrifices to be where he was. Even Elon Musk, I mean, you look at what they do, it's, yeah, you could have all sort of positive, negative, and things. He works hard. So my guess is that publishing, all these great authors that I admire, they work hard. When it comes to experiment, again, there's a lot of, on the design side, there's a lot of things that need to take place, and it helps if you've done these plays right. Having a phenomenon that's real, building an experiment on a task that makes sense, validating this, these are all interesting things. I mean, just to wrap up on this, in a publish or perish job, writing is a craft that we all work on, but those who write well make it counts. It really counts. So I'm not saying that reviewers or editors are going to be superficially wowed by a text that has no meaning, but it's just superbly written. No. We look for meaning, but solid meaning that is expressed well can go a long way. So I'm of the school of thought on this, and that I tend to try to polish my writing as best as I can, because I do think it makes a difference. And in my time as an editor, in my time as a reviewer, I mean, I look at the way I react to papers, and I still review for journals, right, anonymously. But in my time as an editor, when I get a good paper that's well written, has interesting ideas, and they're conveyed well, you look at the feedback from the reviewers, and it makes a difference. So
Denis, what I took from your answer is spend a lot of time thinking about the design and making sure the design is sort of tight, and then invest a lot of time in explaining and presenting your design and the results, like polish, refine your writing so that it's crystal clear to the editor and the reviewers what exactly you did, why you did it, and what you found. Is that sort of?
Yeah, but at the end of the day, I'm afraid that my answer to this question of what does it take to publish experiments in good journals, it's sort of generic, but it's true. Quality work demands effort, and that's that. Now the practical tools we have for this, I mean, get help, friendly reviews, polish your writing, back and forth, put together a nice team of people to work with. All of this works.
Okay. Yeah, so if I understood correctly, sorry, just let me compliment. If I understood correct, so it's not only doing the complete demonstrated steps that you did a rigorous job, but also the storytelling you put in your paper. It's a bridge of both.
We have to be careful about storytelling, because storytelling is not making up something that's not there. It's telling the story of what's there in a way that's convincing. There's a bit of a difference there. And here's how it applies specifically to experiments. Like, for instance, the manipulation. I mean, this is critical for experimental research, right? So you have to make sure that your reviewers, when you talk about your hypothesis in your theory and you're saying, okay, I'm predicting that this has an effect on that, right? Well, you're going to manipulate this predictor, right? And so you want to make sure that when your readers, the three first people you need to convince, the three reviewers, you want to make sure that when they read about your manipulation, they get it. And not only that they get that it matches theory, but they have to get how great it is that you did what you did, how super insightful it is to have done this manipulation, and how super efficient and effective it is with respect to. So this is what you have to convince them, because, like, you know, in survey research, what you typically do is you say, okay, well, we measure this construct. Like, okay, so you have like psychological safety, fine. You define psychological safety based on Edmondson's work, blah, blah, blah. We're using this instrument developed and validated by such and such author, boom. Reviewers understand immediately that, okay, they did things by the book. The challenge for experiment is that you need to convince your reviewers that what you manipulated is true and is valid. And you don't have 3 hours to convince them of that. You need to do that in 1 or 2 paragraphs, perhaps 1 paragraph with a graph, an example, a figure or something. And that part is going to be critical. So it's storytelling in the sense of telling what's true in a convincing way, not just making stuff up.
Wonderful. We'll take one last question from the audience, and then I'll wind up with my questions. But Lucy, you're the last question.
Hello, Professor. I'm also in Montreal, and I teach entrepreneurship at Concordia University. When I first started college, I first started studying landscape architecture. Of course,
Oh, good.
I have a business degree, and I studied.
Then we'll have to meet for coffee. I'm going to be back next week.
Yeah, I study entrepreneurship at the ecosystem level, at the community level. I just wonder if there are any researchers interested in applying the experiment method to the community level of entrepreneurship study. For example, like previously I studied a very small rural community. It's a lot of forest land. I studied interaction between the entrepreneurs' business strategies in the forest, sustainability. For example, if they do timber harvesting, the forest is gone. But if they do ecotourism or carbon credit, the forest is still there, but they probably have different kind of landscape. So I think it would be too late if they do timber harvesting, the forest already gone. It would be really great if we could do some experiment in the beginning. Do you think, is there any like existing literature? Is that interesting question? Yeah.
I don't know if it's of interest to other people, but I'm interested in that. And I know of people who are, you know, Sophie backs stuff on sustainable entrepreneurship, and there's some elements of Sophie and Christina Artel. They've done some work on community entrepreneurship. But there are some people right now who are working on experiments with some of these notions, some of these ideas. It's not necessarily easy to collect data in this environment and to develop relevant manipulation, but there are some teams who are working on this. So the short answer to your question is yes. Vishal, I have some time here, so there's a quick question by Angelo about, should we need to get statistically significant results for our papers to be published? Two elements here. It's not the results that are significant, it's the evidence we have of those results. There's a nuance. This is recorded. Play this again, okay? So I'll repeat. It's not the results that are significant. When you say that, you make it sound like the results are important or not. That's not how it works. It's the evidence that we have that an effect, it's statistically valid. So there's a fine nuance there, but when we say P is smaller than 0.05, we're essentially saying that we have statistically valid evidence, statistically significant evidence that 95% of the time this should pan out. Small nuance. With respect to publishing, more and more journals are very open to non-significant findings. If you have, you know, explanations for why you're not finding what the theory was suggesting, and if this leads into new interesting insights, people are going to be open to this. Some journal editors, I know Johan Wiklund in ETP and Jeff McMullen at JBB have mentioned their openness to this. They want to be more forthcoming. It's the same at AMJ with Mark Gruber.
Wonderful. So Denis, let me sort of move us towards the end. I know we asked you for 40 minutes and we are already at 60 minutes of your time. So can you tell us about one experimental research paper in entrepreneurship that you're currently working on? How did you get the idea? How did you put together the team? How are you, like, what's your plan to submit it to journals? Sort of the whole process in a nutshell.
So, Vishal, I'm going to answer your question, but in a somewhat indirect way. So, I'm at a stage in my career where, especially with the last 4 years, and including a global pandemic, there's been a whole lot going on. So, the dream experiment that I really want to work on as a lead author would be a replication of my dissertation. But the last 5 experimental projects that I'm involved in, including one that's published with Jeff Gish and 4 others where I'm currently involved, I did not have the initial idea. It's some other people who I encountered, either I knew them for many years, meeting at conferences, following their works, or some people graduated at the same time with me, or we are academic friends. You know, they eventually approached me with an idea, and then we saw if we could develop this first online and eventually together. Some people I met specifically at a workshop about experiments, and they approached me with an idea and they wanted to validate something. Sometimes it was like not a job talk, but more of an invited paper that an invented presentation or panel that I did kind of like today. So where I'm going with this is I'm going to accept that I have gray hair, and I'm now at a stage of my career where sometimes, like 20 years ago, it was me who was approaching more older scholars about some of the ideas I had, and I just wanted to pull their ideas. And now I'm at a stage where sometimes people approach me. Now, I'm not saying that you absolutely shouldn't do that to me. It's a free world. You can talk to whoever you want. But I'm at the stage of my career where I will have multiple conversations, and there's a subset of those conversations that may lead into a project that may or may not evolve into a paper. And I'm very much entrepreneurial in this. Like some projects don't go anywhere, some projects go forward. And the reason I wanted to answer your question, Vishal, by this indirect route is to draw your attention, all of people on this call, that academic careers, if you have the benefit of some help, academic careers can be long, and they will evolve. They will change along the way, the same way that you will have the possibility of, if you want, sticking to the same topic all your life, or branching up and augmenting. Melissa and I had the good fortune of meeting before I started my PhD. But eventually we had an opportunity to do some work together. And even if she complains that I was a difficult co-author, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we did have, as far as I'm concerned, we had a great time together. We both learned tremendously about what we were doing, about this, developing an instrument for passion and publishing. I don't regret anything that we did together. I learned tremendously, and she was a great co-author to work with. But my point is that if we have long careers like this, it's possible that you're going to be exposed to different things. So at this stage of my career, I'm in this, and I'm very grateful for this. I'm in these positions where AMJ keeps me pretty busy. These incubators keep me busy, but I'm still involved in research, in part by working with people who are taking the lead on some ideas, and I'm here to help. And I find great pleasure, and I'm learning a lot through this. So I'm hoping that when eventually my term at AMJ will come to an end, and I'll move back to doing my regular activities. And I'm hoping that before the end of my career, I will have a possibility of revisiting some of my initial ideas. But that's a dream. I don't know if it'll happen.
Okay, so Denis, before I ask you my last question about advice to aspiring entrepreneurship researchers, let me share with them something I learned from you when I met with you recently in Toronto. You told me something, and I've been in academia 20 years now, and I had never thought about that. Whether you get an acceptance letter or a rejection letter from the editor, you write to them thanking them for the time they took to review your paper, and you tell them to thank the reviewers on your behalf for the time they took. I mean, what made you do that? Like, what's your logic behind it? Can you share that with our audience? And some of these audiences are also PhD students at Alabama, and I want them to sort of adopt this practice. The rest, I think it's good practice for everyone, but what's the logic here?
The logic is a simple respect and an acknowledgement and gratitude for what people have done. So, I mean, I could go into the psychology of how I came to this, being who I am, in my culture, how I was raised at a certain period of time. I mean, being thankful was important. I started doing this under Dean when I was a student in Colorado, and I guess that was the first letter back to reviewers that we were working. It was an R&R actually, but Dean wasn't a co-author on this. It's the TP paper, but eventually, I mean, I was getting some. I was trained by him, and it happened a little bit after as well. But Dean has always told me that whatever the reviewers say, you may disagree or not agree, but this is what they think, and you have to take this at face value. So when we were working on our response to the reviewers, he would always start each answer by saying, "Thank you for this," or "We're very, very grateful for this," or "This is an interesting question. Thank you very much." I mean, we always start there. That's how he trained me, and so I adopted this style. But even before that, the sort of when you get the letter, the decision letter, the idea of sending some sort of acknowledgement. It was just like you get an email in a professional setting. You just acknowledge. Like if someone has asked you something, you say you answer back. You say, "Okay, thank you." Or if you ask something, people give you an answer, you say thank you back, right? So the origin starts from this. Now, the real reasons why I do it nowadays is because having reviewed 4 papers, I also appreciate that as a reviewer, I spend time on this, and when I get feedback from 3 reviewers and an editor, I know now how long it takes, how much effort go into this, and I remember having one discussion with a friend, and eventually we sort of I remember coming up with an argument. If you look at the amount of money, if you want to wear your economist hat and you think about the value that's put into reviewing, if you assume that 3 reviewers spend at least 3 hours, like 45 minutes reading your papers, 3 hours, at most people are going to be more than that, but let's say 3 hours. So you get 3 people spending 3 hours, and the associate editor spend at least 3 hours. That's probably 12 hours. And you factor in that their average salary rate is, your pick. If you want to make an easy calculations, you can put $100 an hour. That's $1,200. Chances are their salary is probably higher than that, especially at good journals. You have senior board members, is a full-time professors. Most people spend actually more than 3 hours. So most people is going to be closer to 5, which would push the envelope to 20 hours at $250 per hour. That's $5,000. I mean, it goes fast, right? So my point is, if you wear your economic hats, there is dollar value that you get in terms of feedback, and you get that for free because these people did it for free. Some econ journals actually charge when you submit. Management journals, organization science journal, entrepreneurship journals do not. So I think the least you could do is actually not send a thank you note. The least you can do is actually read the feedback and act on it. That's the very least, because there's nothing that would piss me more than receiving a paper that I've just reviewed, and I know that the paper has not been changed because the decision letter was sent this morning, and then this afternoon another journal is asking me to review the same paper. It's impossible that you've acted on the feedback I gave. This happened 3 or 4 times in my lifetime and as a reviewer, so there's nothing that I hate more than this. So this is a lack of disrespect. So first thing, read the feedback on it. But I think it's a polite thing to just send a nice letter to the action editor. Thank you very much. We received the feedback. If it's a rejection, you could say, even if it's not the decision we were hoping for, we are very grateful for the insights that the reviewers generously share, and we will consider that in our efforts to submit this paper to another journal. And it's a very simple 1-sentence message. And if it's an R&R, this is super important because then you want to signal to the action editors, thank you very much. We read the feedback. We understand that there are some strong challenges ahead of us, but we will work our best to integrate this feedback and submit our revision on time. So right away, you're signaling to the action editor, hey, we're super happy. We're acting on the feedback. We're going to deliver on time. It's another signal that's important to send. Do people in the decisions I make do this? No, it's the rare case that I get those messages, but some people do.
And
it's great.
I think because it's so rare, it speaks to how we all need to sort of pay attention to something like this. When you told me this in Toronto, I came back home and told my wife that I learned the kindest, nicest thing about how we should conduct ourselves in our profession. And it's amazing that this is something I learned 20 years in. And, you know, so anyway, with that.
So here's an experiment. So I'm now at AMJ, I've made 168 decisions so far. And this sentence is now part of my letter, but it's been like from the first year, I have a sentence like, if I would appreciate receiving a quick message acknowledging that you've received this letter. I've just this in all my letters. And so I've had this for 3 years, let's say. And so let's say 150 decisions, 120 decisions, perhaps 3 years. That's about right. Probably 20 people did this, but this number is increasing. So there's hope.
Yeah, and I truly hope that many of the junior scholars, researchers, peers, junior professors on this call will also sort of, you know, adopt this practice. But Denis, I think we now need to sort of move towards the end. So the last question, what's the one advice you have for junior scholars interested in publishing in top journals in entrepreneurship?
The one advice about working on projects and trying to publish them, I would go to what Anna taught me in my first year as a doctoral student. It's the value of early reviews, meaning there are 2 ways you can get reviews on or feedback on papers: presenting at conferences or other venues, and friendly reviews. And I still go by this. When I submit a paper, I typically I've had other people read it, people not involved in the research team. So it could be like an academic friend or a colleague at whatever school I'm at, simply because yeah, I just want them to go over the writing one more last time to see if they pick up any. And I typically take people who are not necessarily close to this, but they will read it as a distant person. So that's for the friendly review of the manuscript itself. But yesterday I presented a paper here in Groningen, and I chose a paper that was very, very early, like very, like it's not even close to being submitted, but the analysis are complete. We have a first draft of the paper, and I wanted to see how people reacted to the positioning arguments and also the arguments I was mobilizing to explain or motivate the hypothesis. And what's great when you present these papers at schools, perhaps more so than conferences, is you get a random pool of people who are not necessarily experts on your research. Whereas when you go to conferences, you tend to have people very specific. So I find there's a lot more value in presenting to a more diverse audience, because then you get sort of the raw pushback from the third reviewer, right? The third reviewer was just there as a general reader of whatever journal you submit to. So yesterday I had a lot of questions about, yeah, they wanted me to add control variables. That's the usual, but I had a lot of questions about, like, why are you making this argument? Could you consider this way of approaching it or that way of approaching it? And this was super valuable because it suggested that in the current version of my presentation, but probably of the paper, I'm missing one or two sentences to lead the readers to where I'm going. So this was tremendous feedback to have at that point, because it's going to help me down the road. So I'm going back to the single most important advice: get other people's early feedback. And I'll wrap it up. This is a nice way also, like in architecture school, when we're developing design, we always had the critiques. Like before we presented to the professors, we were working on drafting tables or computers, so other people could see our design. So it was typical. I was in a friendly environment. We would ask each other's comment, and the same way in music, when we rehearse before a show, and whether classical or jazz, I mean the practice with the early feedback of whether this works or not was very important. So I guess I go full circle in the importance of having this early feedback.
On that note, Denis, let me thank you for generously giving us your time, patiently answering all the questions, even when you are far away in Europe on a work vacation. Thank you.
Well, allow me to retort, Vishal. I have to thank you and express my gratitude for first inviting me and honoring me by inviting me to share whatever observation I may have, and I also thank the participants for their time in taking this great set of presentations you have. You've been exposed to great many set of great scholars, and this is all thanks to your professor talking to you participants. So Vishal, you're doing a great job. You're doing a great service to the field. It's a pleasure to know you, and I look forward to meeting you in Boston in August.
Perfect. Thank you, Denis. Take care.